When Overwatch came out in 2016, it really was one of a kind. Even to this day, it still is. It went on to win Game of the Year. It captured experiences and different play styles for characters that no other shooter will ever offer. It really was one of the best, if not the best shooter games of all time, which caused me to sink thousands of hours into the game, even play the game professionally at some point, and stream this game for 6 or 7 years now. It's a beautiful game, and it deserves the credit to be acclaimed in this industry. However, as time went on, a lot of people ended going a different direction from the game. New titles came out, the industry got more competitive. You could say a lot of different things, but we ended up in Overwatch 2, which was supposed to change that and put Overwatch back on the map as a leader in an industry, not kind of falling behind. Aside from the PvE fiasco, which I'm not going to touch on in this video, I wanted to talk about Overwatch 2's PvP and the big debate between 5v5 and 6v6 that I kind of started with my 6v6 video claiming 6v6 was better. A lot of this comes down to preference, but a lot of people claim that tank synergies were what broke Overwatch 1. However, I disagree with that. We kind of accepted these things and accepted these statements from people, but are they actually true? So today we're going to dig down into the life of Overwatch 1 and break down exactly how supports, particularly DLC supports, broke the core fundamentals of the game and ended up breaking the tank role. And the tank players are the ones who have had to bite the bullet for this and take the blame for this, when in reality, it was the design philosophy of Jeff Goodman and Jeff Kaplan back in the day that particularly changed supports, which ended up breaking the entire game. So my point today is that 6v6 was fine the whole time. It was the fundamental design of DLC supports that broke each of these broken metas that we refer to as to why the game had to be changed. And we're going to take a deep dive into the core fundamentals of the game to really show you guys what is what, how things work, and just go through a little trip down memory lane to really get the facts straight so we can move forward and make better decisions for the game. In order to start this conversation, we have to define what allowed Overwatch to flow in the way that it did, right? Overwatch had a unique flow that felt so special across every role that really captivated a player that was logging into the world to play. Every character in the game had a set of core fundamentals that they had to abide by in order to get value. And if a character was able to skip that skill curve and not have to adhere to one of those core principles, they made up for it by dropping off in value in another way. For example, Mercy is not a mechanically intensive character, right? In order to heal players, you don't need to be mechanically good. The drop off to that is that Mercy has little to no offensive potential. So that's how you kind of balance that out when compared to a character like Ana, who does require mechanics to heal and damage. Therefore, she has a little bit greater healing output and actually has an ability to do damage. These 4 core principles that I'd like to establish are mechanical skill, i.e. hitting shots, landing abilities that are skill shots, ability usage, knowing when to use your abilities at the right time, what interactions favor your ability, do you want to use it first, do you want to use it second, just how abilities interact with each other in the game. Number 3 is going to be positioning. Where can I play to get value on my character? Where do I need to set up? Where am I safe? Where am I not, right? Especially more immobile characters, that's something that you have to be much more careful about. For example, Zenyatta has a very high damage output, but to, trade off for that, he has very limited mobility and a hitbox that's easy to hit, meaning that in order to get that power from an offensive potential, you sacrifice mobility and you are very vulnerable in your positioning, meaning a good Zenyatta player has to be very, very smart about where they play or they'll be at risk. And lastly, overall game knowledge, right? What comps favor me, what maps favor me, what positioning favors me, right? Kind of all of those things above, like where do I need to shoot and win, right? Just overall collective general knowledge of the game. Most characters in the game, in fact, every character in the game at launch, had to abide by those 4 core principles, and if they excelled at something else, there was a drop-off on one of the other parts of their kit. I think Ana is the best example of a character like this, right? Where she requires all 4 of those things to be executed at a high degree, but if you do execute on those things, you get enormous value, and she fits into the mold of the game very well. However, if you misplay, you're also punishable and end up paying the price for those mistakes. Another great example would be Lucio, right? Where you have to make the decision between healing or speeding your team. You're at risk when doing so because you actually have to be close enough to them to get that value and be engaging with your teammates to get that value. You have to have good mechanics to wall ride and be safe with your positioning and go in for duels. You have to be able to hit your shots. Also, knowing when to boop different players when tanks dive you, or whatever happens, right? Like, you have to have extensive knowledge of the game to do all of those things, and you have to actually execute. So Lucio and Ana are two great examples of that. And let's take a deep dive into some of Gale Adelaide's plays way back in the day on Ana to really showcase the core values of the game for all the characters. All right, we are way back in the day here, guys. OG Overwatch. Let's take a look at some of Gale's gameplay and decision-making here and show you how Ana has to adhere to those core values that made Overwatch a really fun game. So, let's take a look. He has to come up and peek and actually aggressively nade into their team, right? Which means now that he's used his nade and made that choice, he's now vulnerable, right? He had to execute the nade's positioning, read where their team was, understand that he's safe, time it with his Winston. He had to adhere to all those core fundamentals of the game. And look at what ends up happening here. Now, as his team is diving, he has to actively make a decision to heal his Genji, which means if his Winston is in and taking damage, he has to choose as a player which one of these targets to heal. If you make the wrong decision, one of your teammates could die, which means you have to actually be smart. You have to actively be making the proper decision as a support player to get value on the fight. And because he naded aggressively, he's now vulnerable to the dive from the Tracer, which means he actually put himself at risk. There was a drop off to the decision that he made to throw that aggressive nade and try to make a play for his team. He has to then reload, which makes him have downtime while his Winston is critical. Sometimes your Winston might die. You have to be aware as to when you are making these choices so that you can actually be a good player. His Winston jumps in, and he realizes his Winston is crit, so he decides to throw the heal nade at him, right? Again, putting himself at risk to enable his front line. Also getting a big nade here. So what does that mean for Gale as a player on Ana? He is now vulnerable, and if he missed the nade or made a bad decision, he could end up dying to this Tracer, who ends up getting booped, but his nade ends up getting the kill on the Winston. But while this is happening, he's getting dueled by the Tracer, which means his Winston over here is not able to be healed, and I believe this Winston ends up dying. So by throwing his nade forward and then having to duel the Tracer, because this Tracer recognized that, it put this Winston at risk, and that Winston ended up dying for that decision. That flow of ideas of every choice you make may potentially have a consequence is extremely prevalent when you're talking about single target healing supports, because they can't have their kits just bail out bad decisions or decisions that have negative outcomes automatically. That's what made Ana so beautiful. Every choice you made has a massive, massive impact. So their Winston ends up dying for this, right? He then has to heal up the Genji. He has to mechanically execute, play well, be in line of sight, right? There actually has to be threads connecting these players. And if somebody makes a mistake and goes too far away, well, you might pay the price for it. So he comes back, heals his Genji up, and then I think he's going to look for another nade here. I think he does look for another nade here. As the Mercy's going to die, he looks for a nade on the front line. And look at what happens here. He walks up, uses his sleep dart, and then uses his nade. He walks in and uses both of his cooldowns. However, he's in bad positioning because he walked into their team, used both of his cooldowns, so now he's vulnerable. He misused those two abilities, and look at what ends up happening to him. He's going to end up dying here because their diva, the off-tank role, and this is going to be a very important theme, has recognized that he has misused his cooldowns and he is out of position. According to those core values of the game, because he made those mistakes, he got punished and actually died for it. And the off-tank role is the role that is the best at actually punishing that. So every decision he makes, if he makes a good one, he got rewarded for it, i.e. that anti-nade that was perfectly timed on his Winston that antied their Winston and heal buffed his. Their Winston ended up dying. That's what led them to winning the fight. Although, when he went in and misused his cooldowns, he ended up getting punished for it, particularly by that off-tank role, who watched him make that bad decision. Let's look at this fight here, particularly at what tanks had to do, right? When tanks made a bad decision, with two tanks in the game, with the tank synergies, there weren't enough support abilities to automatically bail them out because healing was much more limited. So, for example, look at Gale this fight. His Winston goes too far forward. This forces Gale to use his nade to heal both of his tanks, meaning that he's now vulnerable, right? His tanks made a mistake, and because the supports had a limited amount of healing they could actually put out, they were actually vulnerable in the backline because of this tank's bad decision. So now their tank has to go forward, their diva gets demeched, it forces the beat early, and they actually had to pay the price for their tanks misplaying and taking too much damage before the fight. There was no way to bail these players out for free, and they end up dying because there aren't enough resources to completely bail these tanks out from making bad decisions. They did end up dying to the Riptire, and there was a big ult exchange that fight, but that concept is really, really important. The amount a support could actually do to automatically negate a mistake was significantly lower, and the cost on the support's end was much greater because there was a risk to it. That concept forced tank players to have to play more conservatively with their resources and their synergies, if you will, because if there were less bailout mechanics and less healing overall for them to actually get out of misplay situations, they had to be more careful. So if you were a bad tank who took more damage, most likely your supports would either not get the cooldowns on you to let you survive, but even if they did, good players on the other team would recognize that their supports had to burn all of their resources to bail you out of your mistake and then go and punish your backline. This meant that no matter what role you were playing, as long as you could execute on those core values positionally, no matter what character you were on, you were going to be able to get a ton of options for value, which made the game feel very open, free, fair, and enjoyable for each role because everybody had an opportunity to make a play. This also kept the skill ceiling of the game very high because it allowed players to continuously discover new ways to play the game and get value. There weren't heroes and abilities that almost allowed you to have infinite resources and uptime that just bailed players out of any mistake they made. If those abilities existed in the way they are now, the role it would punish the most is the tank, because tanks are the best at taking position and actually forcing resources out of players. So if those resources get so good that that isn't valuable, one of the biggest ways for tank players to actually get value becomes non-existent. That wasn't something that was in the game back in the day when it was in its glory days. Sadly though, as time went on, you started to see those rules of the game, those principles be broken, and the next character that got released really showed that.
We are bedeviled by the mysteries of creation. Science can reveal the truths that lie behind these many questions. What we learn can unlock the true potential of humanity.
Let's talk about the first time you started to see those core fundamental rules get broken, and that was Moira. I mean, Moira, let's break her down real quick. Moira was the first character that adhered to the design model that is flawed from Jeff Kaplan and Jeff Goodman in that they wanted to make that complicated game at first and make it easier over time. However, what they didn't understand is that what they thought was making the game easier just meant you were making something better that allowed players to break the rules of the game that ended up making these meta comps that broke the game in turn. So let's break down Moira. She has no mechanical requirement to heal or win duels, right? You can just kind of right click on a player. It's basically auto aim and throw damage orbs, though you might not get the kill all the time. It's not necessarily about how meta it was. It's, are you adhering to the core rules of the game and having a fair drop off for getting to skip certain aspects of the game that made it game of the year, that made it fun, like Mercy, having very limited offensive potential because she doesn't require that mechanics, right? However, Moira was able to win a decent amount of these duels without any mechanical requirement. She also was able to heal the entire team with high numbers of AoE healing. If you want to have AoE healing be fair, it has to be like Lucio's, where it's a low amount of healing, or else the tanks won't get punished for actually misusing their resources because it's super easy for a support to bail them out at low risk, or no risk in Moira's case, because Moira has a fade on top of all those abilities to get out of jail for free. So if she misplays or her tanks misplay, she would have to go up and heal them. If that was an Ana, the Ana would have to nade, pick which tank to heal, make the correct decision, and then be punishable after the fact for that misplay from the tank. However, if it's a Moira, she can walk up, heal them, bail them both out of the decision, and then fade away and be at way less risk, right? Not to mention, you could stack Heal Orb with it, right? And build that Coalescence super quickly. So you're breaking the mechanical side of things, you're breaking the decision-making side of things, you're breaking the positional side of things, right? And her resources were barely finite. It was very easy to actually build your healing back up just by right-clicking at another tank and kind of juggling those things. So what they thought was making the game lower at the skill floor just opened the opportunity for these tank synergies to be broken, because supports are what enabled this. And the first time you saw this happen was in the Overwatch Contenders Gauntlet, where Fusion University, which was one of the best teams to ever play in Contenders, that team is regarded to be one of the best ever, were playing British Hurricane. You'll see a lot of familiar names in this match, and British Hurricane ended up running the first comp that you really see break the game with Lucio Moira quad tank. And now you did see a triple tank meta previously in the game, though that was because they had just reworked D.Va, and she was just overbuffed. She got tuned down pretty quickly. Pause, cut the tape. I'm actually wrong here. Big shout out to this Twitter user who caught this. That original tank meta, believe it or not, was actually caused by Ana's nade being too strong with a 5-second duration and a 100% heal increase. The developers actually acknowledged this, crediting that meta to Ana's nade being too powerful when matched up with heroes that have large health pools. So the devs actually knew this at the start of the game, which makes you say again that this design model was intentional. They acknowledged it and they knew it, and yet continued down this path knowing that these types of supports would break the game. Again, huge shout out to this Twitter user for catching it. I would have missed it. Appreciate you, bud. Let's get right back to it. First time that Moira broke the rules of the game, and you started to see these comps emerge where it's like, okay, well, open queue metas might not be doable, and if you could not run Moira with this comp, the tanks would not be able to get healed enough by the Ana, and the Ana would be super punishable by the DPS and a lot of these dive characters. But because Moira could bail them all out for free almost at a way lower requirement and not be at nearly enough risk, they were able to win the match 3-0 just by mainly playing this comp. And if you thought it stopped there, the next hero that would come out ended up making this principle even more extreme and breaking the game in a way that it would never recover from. And it's regarded to be the single most oppressive meta in esports history.
When my godfather was called back to Overwatch, I tried to convince him not to go. He wouldn't listen. In the end, I can't let him fight alone. Just doing my part.
She was designed to bring something different to the game. Innovation, new tactics, a fresh approach. Instead, she destroyed Overwatch.
Brigitte was too powerful. There's just too much there.
I want to know who at Blizzard thought it was a good idea to release a hero like this.
They will just simply swap it away. Crucial time lost here for the Outlaws. You want your team to win, right? They're going to have to play what's meta.
Beginning of the end, Brigitte, right? Brigitte broke every single rule of the game, and she is the sole reason as to why GOATS comp was able to exist, not only as long as it did, but be as strong as it was. Let's break down the core rules that Brigitte broke. She has no mechanical requirement for healing or damage outputs, right? She can easily outduel the DPS, especially at her launch, though that did get tuned down over time. And it really goes to show you, even after 20 plus nerfs from the developers, when we left Overwatch 1 to go into Overwatch 2, in the betas while Overwatch League was playing, the meta had guess who still in it? Brigitte. Right? She had to be nerfed again going into Overwatch 2, so none of those nerfs proved to be effective. And that's because the fundamental design of the character was the problem, and they never sat down and addressed it. The big thing being the two forms of healing that she could stack. One of them being a massive range Inspire AoE healing ability that was so broken, we're going to compare it to Lucio's volume. Look at how much bigger the range was on Briggs' Inspire compared to Lucio's AoE healing. Not only did Brigitte not have to be near them, but they only had to be in the range of the activation to get healed for the 6 seconds that Inspire allowed, meaning that she didn't have to position near them, they didn't have to stay near her, they could go wherever they want. As long as they were in the Inspire when it was activated, they could go across the map and still be getting healed for another 6 seconds. She could also stack that healing with her burst healing health pack that burst healed targets for about maybe 120 health, maybe it was 80 health, I'm not sure the exact number.
Shield's taking damage. Patching you up.
What? But that pack could also overheal them and apply additional armor on top of it being used with Inspire. She had a very forgiving positional requirement that didn't put her at risk for healing this entire team, but she was also able to heal and duel at the same time. Unlike Ana, who has to really sit down and make a decision every second. If she makes the wrong one, somebody's gonna get punished and die, especially if it's one of the tanks. So while Ana has to make that decision between dueling a target and healing her team, Brig's kit at its base does all of it for her. Not to mention, she can also stun and flail that DPS or tank hero, whoever it may be who's diving your backline or dueling a tank on the front end. She can literally force them out, damage them, negate their damage whilst healing, which is something the original supports were not capable of doing, and if they were, they had a ton of risk associated with their kit. The best example of this would be Zenyatta, who is super vulnerable to have the ability to heal his tank at a minimal amount that is not as strong as Briggs and actually do damage at the same time. He has to be in range of those tanks where there's a drop off to where they could go kill him. But Brigitte, because she had a Winston bubble on her shield and a tank health pool, did not have to worry about any of those things at all, breaking actually all of the core requirements of the original game. Brig is the hero that allowed tank comps to be even more broken because of how she passively peeled all of them, healed all of them, and were able to force damage heroes away from being able to punish the misuse of tank cooldowns. And she did all of this at an incredibly minimal risk requirement compared to the original supports. Unless you ended up mirroring the GOATs, in which case you could actually run her over. She forced the game to be in that playstyle. And to credit Frito, had hero bans existed, Brigitte would have been banned pretty much every game, and you would have still seen DPS comps get played in open queue. As long as a hero like Brig exists that breaks all of the core fundamentals of what the original game entailed, tank synergies would always be too overpowered, in that it wasn't the usage of the abilities that were OP, it was that you just got healed so much that it didn't matter if you misused them. Those tank synergies always existed in the game. It's just when AoE healing supports that could do everything and bypass these core fundamentals existed, it just didn't matter. It wasn't the tank's fault, it was the supports. And what proved this, in my opinion, was the emergence of Sombra Goats, which I found it very ironic that Avril and Jake would argue for 5v5 when Jake's team was the team to beat the best Goats team to ever play the game, the San Francisco Shock, in a thrilling Map 5 match that I'm sure everybody remembers by dropping one of the tanks for Dante on Sombra. They still ran the triple support because that was more essential in that matchup, in that meta, than the triple tank. The Sombra Goats comp emerged and started beating tons and tons of Goats teams, and there was like a little micro meta shift, I remember, because I was playing in contenders at that time, to a lot of teams playing that Sombra Goats. If the tank synergies were so OP and more OP than the support synergies, why did you see Sombra Goats emerge and become successful? To counter Avril's point that he also brought up in the debate, try and run triple support without Goats. There were plenty of triple support comps without Goats. You saw Monkey Diva Soldier, Lucio Zen Brig, right? There were tons of different variants of that style of comp because triple support with supports that broke the fundamentals of the game were far more broken than anything triple tank was capable of doing to the original core values of the game. So do not let people who are trying to say 5v5 is better tell you that the tank synergies were the most OP thing in the game. The only reason these comps got out of hand can always be tracked back to the AoE healing, rule-breaking supports that denied value on forcing tank synergies out of position. Every single one of these metas can be traced back to those supports, and that's where we're taking this conversation next, the infamous double shield meta with the most oppressive part of role queue. Let's go ahead and talk about that. Now, I will admit, Orisa and Sigma were absolutely too strong at the start of Double Shield, right? Sigma had like a 1200 HP barrier. It was insane, and Orisa's barrier was super, super strong as well. It was kind of a rush playstyle with Doom, Reaper, Lucio, Moira, though I wonder if that comp would exist without Moira. But the bottom line is that is one meta where the heroes, again, were just super, super strong individually. They adhered to Jeff Goodman and Jeff Kaplan's design model that was flawed, that was to make an easier game over time, even though what that actually meant was just making do-it-all characters with no weakness. These characters had the strongest barriers in the game, the strongest range damages in the game, and also the best sustain and brawl abilities in the game. And if you combine that with AoE healing, well, of course, you're going to end up breaking the game altogether. This is why even when you saw the barrier health get cut in half, Orisa and Sigma stayed dominant, because it never was their barriers that were powerful, it was Fortify, which is why in this game, Overwatch 2, without the second tank and without the shield, you still see people complaining about Orisa, because Fortify actually right now is as strong as it was in Overwatch 1, minus a little bit of the overhealth that you get. You can't headshot it, you can't CC it, and you get 50% damage reduction. While Sigma also had his Grasp, which was a Matrix-like ability that healed him for additional, or gave him overhealth for additional damage that he took, even with his barrier and range poke and stun. If you compare these characters to Reinhardt or Zarya, who had a finite barrier or one bubble for themselves and a lower health pool, how is it that the tanks that have ranged poke, CC on both of their kits have better brawl and sustain abilities than the Reinhardt and the Zarya, the OG brawl tanks of the game? They had everything on their kit, and the developers never wanted to remove those abilities or nerf them drastically because it was their design model. They thought they were making the game easier, but they really were just replacing what made the game great originally. But even with that difference, even with those tanks being overkitted, if you could not run DLC AoE healing supports and you had to run Mercy Ana or Lucio Ana, you still could play other comps other than Double Shield into Double Shield effectively, because the supports wouldn't be able to heal enough to actually stop players from piercing the barrier and doing raw damage to these characters. You could play dive and split and punish characters behind them, because if Ana had to come forward and use her nade on the team and actually have to make the decision to heal one or the other and not heal all of them at once and have those two abilities stacked together like Brigand Baptiste, the backlines would actually be punishable. And as I referred to at the start of this video when talking about Gale and reviewing his footage, when he walked up and misused his abilities, that's what heroes like Diva were very good at punishing, like Zarya were very good at punishing. Heck, even Wrecking Ball, some of the DLC characters that you had out there. Reinhardt, if you misused your cooldowns and were first forced forward and didn't have exo boots to jump away, flail and CC to knock people away, you were actually punishable for misplaying. But the DLC supports were not, which is why tank became a miserable role to play, because unless you played the more boring, not fan favorite Orisa and Sigma characters, you didn't have enough abilities on your kit to match up with the do-it-all characters that they continued to put in the game to make it easier. It didn't make the game easier, it replaced what was fun about the game for most of these players.
Dude, oh my god! Stop it! Oh, dude, I'm done with my... Oh my god! Oh my god! This is never gonna be able to die. Oh my god! Dude!
Combine that with all the CC that got added to the game, and that's why you saw a massive exodus from people wanting to play tank, which is why it played a big part in us moving to 5v5. Before we get into 5v5 though, instead of nerfing these characters properly, Blizzard refused to do that for some reason. If they nerfed Drone, which was a 250 health drone at first to about 150 HP, they compensated it in his ultimate and made his ult massive or increased his damage. They wouldn't nerf these overpowered characters, they would simply distribute their value elsewhere, which makes no sense because they were simply better characters. Instead of fundamentally changing these characters, they would rather nerf Brigitte 20 plus times. I don't know about you guys, but the definition of insanity should kick in here. If you have to nerf a character 20 plus times, maybe something's fundamentally wrong with the design, and that's why it's too good. Maybe you got to take a step back and look at it from a different angle. Instead, they tried to change the format of the game, and even when they did that in the Overwatch 2 betas, the pro players were still playing on Overwatch 2. Guess who was still meta at the start of Overwatch 2? Brigitte. Because her fundamental design was still incredibly powerful and strong. In 6v6, these problems were fixable by balance. It was a pretty, frankly, easy fix. You can't have the DLC heroes do multiple things in the game and break all those core principles that made the game fun for the original cast back in the day. Instead, almost all of them did. All you had to do was change 4 or 5 characters fundamentally, and the game would have been able to work. However, the solution we came up with was to go to 5v5, which has actually caused more problems than it solved, and this is where we're going to get into the crux of the big debate recently. Let's segue to 5v5 and talk about the goals of 5v5. What did it want to achieve? Let's start by focusing on the tank role here. 5v5 wanted to make tank more approachable for people, let you kind of be the star, the striker, if you will. And I'm going to refer to this SVB clip from the Group Up podcast where they're talking about tank and the star power and the realization that while tanks were supposed to be the stars, that's not actually how it ended up playing out.
For example, real sports. I don't know American stuff, guys, so I'm sorry, but Salt will feel me when I talk about football. It's like everyone wants to be the striker, right? Everyone wants to be the guy who's scoring goals. Nobody wants to be the goalkeeper. That's like you eventually convert to being a goalkeeper later on when you're a kid, because like nobody wants to be that guy. Nobody wants to be the defenders. Everybody's like, I want to score goals. I want to be the hero. Why is Overwatch so different in that way? Why is it that like the one role that's like the most pressure is also the most miserable? Why is tank not the star role, right? Like why is the game not made in a way where if we're gonna ask this one role to bear the burden of like you must dictate the engagements, you must eat all the crap for the rest of your teammates, why is it also like the least powerful role? Why is it like, why is that not the star role? Why don't we want tank to be the role that everyone gravitates towards, where all the people who are like, oh, I want to be the carrier, I want all the glory. Go, be the tank, take all the pressure, but you get to decide the win too. Okay, that's the trade-off. Well, at the moment, it feels like the trade-off is you get fucked.
The reason why tanks don't feel this way in 5v5 is because of the same reason we referred to at the start of this video. How tanks got value in the original game was by punishing players who were out of position who misused their cooldowns, particularly squishies, right? So if an Ana or a support walked forward and misused their abilities, the tank could actually dive on them and get that kill. Tanks probably got value that way about 50% of the time, but because supports over the years, and especially in 5v5, have all been given these get out of jail free abilities constantly, now you cannot get value that way because the supports are too tanky. And not only is the individual support tankier with more abilities to get out of jail, like Kiriko TP, Cleanse, Lifeweaver Grip, Petal, Ilari Boop, right? All 3 of the new supports have abilities like that. Now, instead of having another tank to help you potentially force out one of those abilities and actually secure a kill while one of you forces it and the other cleans it up depending on the positioning of the fight, now you're going up against both of those abilities by yourself. Usually it ends up being closer to 4 abilities, considering most supports have 2. But I'm going to refer to this super clip here that Flats reacted to, guys. If super can't do it, how in the world is your average player supposed to be able to do that?
It's one of the best to ever do it, can't do it. Maybe something's wrong.
Wow! Holy sh**, that's annoying! Holy shit! You say support's not the most impactful?
What's funny about this is that Super actually played this perfectly. Like, there wasn't anything more he could do as a hero, which goes to show you the fundamental design flaws of 5v5 and what happens when you give supports too many tools. That's what's happened throughout all of Overwatch's life. They've kept tooling supports for no reason. They keep making supports unpunishable, and the role that hurts the most always has been the tank. In 5v5, because supports got half of that tank's power that was lost from the game, they're going to have even stronger bailout abilities, meaning the best way to get value is what Spylo said, indirect value from the tank. You're supposed to be this superstar, but really all you're doing is being a puppet master to your support and actually just trying to force out all their invulnerability abilities and pierce through healing on a tank that has more health and more healing than it did in Overwatch 1. Meaning you can't actually burst through that target. This happens all the time on tank, and this is why you started to see again a massive exodus from the role, because 5v5 forces the exact same thing that drove people away from playing tank in the first game and makes it even more prevalent in the second game. Segueing to the second point here, what made heroes unique in Overwatch 1 was that they couldn't do everything and they excelled at something specific. This actually allowed for more unique and specialist tank design and hero design in general to come into the game. This is what gave these heroes their identity and made Overwatch stand out as a game. For example, Roadhog and Ball both had very unique niches in the game that only were able to happen in 6v6. I'm going to refer to the Group Up podcast again and listen to this quote from Flats.
Hog got put off into the ranch, and like there was nothing to do. Like that was legitimately, in my opinion, correct answer. Like there was no other answer, which I'm saying was the best answer. There just wasn't another one, and so we're gonna have that problem, and it's only gonna get worse as more characters come out, because there's just this this philosophy that will not change.
A lot of people trying to defend 5v5 said that Blizzard had more freedom when designing characters in 5v5, but that actually isn't true, because in Overwatch 1, you could design characters with a niche and have them really be focused on that niche and have them work in this square format. But now in Overwatch 2, if they don't have covers for any weakness that they may have and don't fit this circular design, well, that hero's never gonna get picked, because now every single character is competing for one spot. So if your hero has an obvious weak point, someone can just counter swap you on the other team and force you off that character because you don't have a second tank to compensate for you. A great example of this is Roadhog. He kind of fit into the mold of that off-tank only style of play, and now that off-tank only style of tank simply cannot exist in the game. Wrecking Ball was another big loser of this model. So if you played Hog and Ball in Overwatch 1, sorry guys, there's no room for your tank in this game, and there's no option about it. Flats is right. 5v5 forced this. There are not more options to design characters and tanks in Overwatch 2. There are less options, because if it has a single weak point, the other team will be able to hard counter swap you and force you off that character, rendering it completely obsolete. Unless you buff this character up to the point where it's hard meta. But if you do that, then there's no room for any other tank to make its way into the meta or be picked. And this is an unsolvable problem via balance in 5v5. So many people try to strawman the argument or get stuck in this recursive loop of, well, maybe if we buff this character can fix it. Oh, well, if you buff this character, now the other characters are obsolete. There's no room for a second tank to actually fit in the game, so the tanks are either all or nothing. This goes directly against the interest of casual players who didn't have to deal with the oppressive tank synergies that the top level players had to deal with. As many of the 5v5 defenders claim, they were so oppressive, yet no one in low ranks picked them. But now, because there's only one tank, even the lower SR casual players who just want to play one of their two of their favorite characters, that's all they've ever wanted to do. We learned this in Overwatch 1. Casuals only want to play their favorite heroes. Now those players who want to play their favorite heroes, and really only them, which tend to be the more popular Overwatch 1 characters that can get hard countered, like Reinhardt versus Orisa, who they could pick Orisa and just deny your value. Or if you want to pick Diva, they just pick Zarya and beam right through you. They have to deal with this counter swapping issue, where if you don't counter swap, you get rolled. These players would rather stick on that character and get rolled all game than swap. This is what has happened, and that's why you see so many more steamrolls in the lower level of play. The rock, paper, scissors-esque of the game cannot be fixed with balance. because there's only room for one tank. So if one tank gets buffed, by definition, no matter what you do, the other tanks are losers. And you can't fix that unless there's a second tank in the game to help mitigate that and allow other heroes to backfill into the most dominant tank at that time. It's unsolvable in 5v5, and this is a new problem that has really taken away from the experience of what made tanking fun in Overwatch for your casual player back at home. And while in 6v6, balance could solve it, 5v5, no matter how you balance the characters, this principle will always be there, and Flats is starting to kind of realize this. The game is dumbed down, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's simply forced in this format. I'm going to play another clip of SVB starting to realize this.
It's a dumbing down of the game. I know, I can already hear Samito's voice in the back of my head being like, it's a 6v6 problem, SVB, it's a 6v6 problem, like this wouldn't be a problem in 5v5. I think it can be solved. Again, I agree with Flats, is that I don't really have a dog in the race. I just want Overwatch to be good. And I think there's so much 5v5 can offer. We just really barely explored it because we keep going back to this. And I really don't want the game to turn into this. I really don't want the game to turn into this very one-dimensional basic, like, we're just playing rock, paper, scissors with extra steps and better graphics.
I used to think this as well. You could just balance the game better and make it work, until I realized I was going up in a loop and I never actually had a concrete answer as to how to make all these heroes fixable. I ask anybody who's defending 5v5 this question: can you write down specifically on paper exactly what you would do to solve this problem? Give me a specific, exact answer. And when you realize that you can't, that's when you realize you're stuck. Because if you try to fix one hero in one direction, it simply is just going to immediately be replaced by another. And that character is just going to be left behind because there's no second role for them to fit into, which allowed so many different tank comps to be played and added depth to the game. There is no way out. And this is a new problem not caused by hero design, which is why balance can't fix it. This one is caused by the format. 5v5 has clearly failed in its mission to make tank a more approachable and fun role. It destroyed what made it fun for casuals, and that's why you're seeing these steamrolls. It can't be solved in this format via balance. It needs to be solved via a format change. Let's close this video out and put a nice little bow on this with some bullet points summarizing what we discovered today. Number 1, the new heroes didn't abide by the same rules and principles as the original cast, the game that won Game of the Year. These heroes were allowed to break the rules and ended up overshadowing and just bypassing what made the game so great for so many people. Those oppressive tank metas that everyone pointed to as to why the tank role had to continue to suffer were all caused by supports, and anytime a big tanky meta came up, a support was the root cause of that. Blizzard and the Overwatch community continued to run away from these problems instead of tackling them head on. These DLC supports and DLC tanks kept coming out, kept getting buffed, continued to be more and more broken, and instead of acknowledging the problems, we just changed formats again and again until eventually the game ended up breaking to the point where it's at now. Balance in hero design is actually harder in 5v5 than it is in 6v6. There's much less of a margin for error when buffing and nerfing tanks to make quote-unquote everything viable. The new hero design, specifically the tanks, can't really excel at a niche. They have to be able to do it all, or they won't get picked very often. And God forbid a casual player wants to fall in love and sink all this time into these characters, well, if it's not the flavor of the month, it's going to be very hard for you to pick it. If it has a single weakness, a single chink in the armor, well, it can't exist as a tank. Unlike in 6v6, these new 5v5 problems cannot be solved via balance. The rock, paper, scissors ideology will always be there, and it's never been easier to counterpick a tank and ruin their fun, regardless of the rank. And unlike in Overwatch 1, you really didn't see that problem too much in low ranks, and now your experience can just be held hard hostage by anyone else in that lobby. The reality is Overwatch was designed for 6v6 and simply was a better game that allowed more in that format. You were able to pick more freely, express yourself, and identify with different characters that had unique things they brought to the game more. The game simply flowed better. It allowed for more counterplay. The reality is 6v6 was ruined by the DLC support hero design model, and tank players have been taking the blame for this for years. However, I think today this video proves to all of you at home, it was never the tank players' fault. The biggest rule breakers and the biggest game breakers have been and always will be the DLC support heroes that do it all. And the answer moving forward for Overwatch to get back to that core experience that won it Game of the Year, that made the game feel free, open, amazing, have a ton of depth, is to take this game back to 6v6 and only look to adjust the several core characters that were able to cheat the game, bypass the learning curve, and not follow the rules like everyone else, again, particularly in that support role. This game, as long as it's in 5v5, will never be able to reach its peak, and it's safe to say at this point, what is the point of staying in 5v5 if we know now there's no way for it to ever be better than it was in 6v6? I've been your host. I hope you guys learned a lot in today's video, and this video proves that it was never the tank's fault, but it was always the DLC supports. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you all next time. Be sure to leave a comment down below with your opinion. Talk to you later. See ya.